Assalamu alaikum and good evening if you're tuning in from this part of the world. Good afternoon if you are coming in from Europe. And good morning if you are in the Americas. My name is Zeeshan Salahuddin, and I serve as the director for the Center for Regional and Global Connectivity at Tabadlab. Welcome to the latest in our series of policy roundtables. Our topic for today is the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which began nearly 3 months ago on February 24th, during the visit of our then Prime Minister, Mr. Imran Khan, a move that had severe and significant geopolitical repercussions, as well as significant optical challenges. Our policy conversation today will focus on the war's effect on Europe, the globe at large, particularly the Eastern Scandinavian countries, the now kinetic front of what many are calling the Neo-Cold War, as well as drawing some direct lines to sectoral impacts within Pakistan. Excellency Rosenholm, the Honorable Ambassador of Denmark to Pakistan, has unexpectedly had travel plans and will not be able to unfortunately join us, but she sends her regards. However, we have a phenomenal panel of domestic and international experts that will be weighing in on this particular issue today. We have Michael Meyer. He is the founder and executive director of Democracy Reporting International. He has worked in dozens of countries around the world, published numerous briefing papers, reports, memos, and writes extensively on a range of international publications, including The Guardian and the EU Observer. Michael's resume is as vast as the day is long, so I'll stop there. Welcome, Michael. We also have with us Dr. Rollie, Associate Professor on Transnational Security at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Her research work focuses on terrorism, religious extremism, human rights, China, and South Asia. Previously, she was the Associate Professor at the U.S. Department of Defense Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Thank you, Dr. Lal, for being with us today. We also have with us Andrej Matisak, Deputy Chief of Foreign Desk for the Pravda Daily. He's a seasoned journalist and has reported on a range of issues, a lot of which actually sort of intersect with foreign policy and security. His specialties include global security, terrorism, US policies and foreign policy, China, NATO, and the EU. So a very timely sort of inclusion in this particular policy roundtable, given his background. And then finally, from Pakistan, we have Saddam Hussein, research economist at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. He writes frequently for a range of national and international publications, including The News, The Diplomat, Modern Diplomacy. And the work that he pursues focuses on security, institutional frameworks, politics, and as him and I have done so for many years together on Pak-Afghan affairs. Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us and for making the time this evening. We'll dive right into it. So the war in Ukraine has created the sort of almost existential threat, the specter, that Europeans have not experienced for 77 years, since 1945, since the end of the Second World War. President Zelensky yesterday condemned NATO for doing practically nothing and refused to cede any territory to Russia to sort of try and end the invasion. All indicators point towards the sort of protracted, almost attritional sort of warfare that will continue in this conflict. I'll start with you, Michael, since you have spent quite a bit of time in Ukraine. And I understand that DRI also has offices there. What is the logical conclusion to this conflict and its implications for the European community? Knowing everything that we know right now, can we expect anything to come from the negotiations? And finally, could you also, especially for people in our part of the world, sort of explain why this creates such a clear and present sense of panic for Europeans?
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and greetings to the fellow panelists. I think, yes, the 24th of February was really a tremendous shock moment across Europe. In a way, this had started much earlier, of course. Russia had attacked Ukraine since 2014, but many people chose to look away and hope that that was the worst and it wouldn't get worse, but it became much worse on the 24th of February. And it's a direct challenge at the heart, I think, at what Europe tried to create after the Second World War, which was an order built on the rule of law, on recognized borders, on the autonomy of states to choose their destiny. And all this has been upended in a way that we could not have imagined. It was an assault at dawn, if you want, of a big country on a slightly smaller country of 40 million people, Ukraine. This has many elements, and I cannot explore all of them. But important is to notice, if we talk about the rule of law and the rules of international engagement, that Russia had actually promised to respect the borders of Ukraine in 1994, when Ukraine had nuclear weapons, and agreed, also under US pressure, to hand these weapons to Russia. These were all weapons from the Soviet Union, and in exchange, the United States, the UK, and Russia would recognize and protect the borders of Ukraine. And all this has been upended by Russia for many years. So it's a direct threat to the European peace order. If we look into the future, at the moment, the war of attrition looks like the most likely scenario, which could go on many months or even years without a clear conclusion, because at the moment I do not see any elements that make me think that Russia wants to stop this war as it stands. It keeps going. There have been negotiations. Maybe we can talk a bit more about them. What's interesting is that they're very asymmetric. We clearly know what Ukraine wants, but it's quite unclear what Russia actually wants. The statements have been on a continuum, if you want. In the most extreme case, there have been publications and there have been writing by Putin himself, who denies that basically Ukraine is a nation and is a state. And if that's the assumption, then the objective is to destroy Ukraine completely. And then we can know that this war will go on for a very long time. But in my mind, Putin is not a very good strategist. He's always a tactician. His consideration could change, but only if there's very much resistance. And in my view, talking about the rest of the world, the stronger the condemnation from the rest of the world, the earlier this war can stop, because the Kremlin does care about what the rest of the world thinks. So this would be my opening remarks. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Michael. And yes, I do completely agree. I think the Kremlin is also coming off of the back of a range of these sort of kinetic measures, whether that's Moldova or Georgia or Crimea, or sending troops into some of the CAR states to stabilize particular governments. And tactically, I think the thinking was that this would not be a protracted conflict. I will come back to you a little bit later, because I do want to unpack what it means for the rest of the world to condemn this in very strong words, because that seems to be happening. But as President Zelensky today himself said, the practical aspect of it amounts to just about nothing. But I'll pivot now to Andrej. Sort of the same question, maybe more of an anecdotal sort of viewpoint, why this invasion has been so terrifying for Europeans. And more importantly, we speak of the neo-Cold War. The Cold War itself was sort of this paradigmatic thing that shaped global politics for decades. It defined geostrategy, it defined geopolitics, geoeconomics, security, foreign policy, interstate relationships. Many call the ongoing US trade war with China the neo-Cold War, especially with the US shifting all of its attention to China as the main threat to global primacy and hegemony. However, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is sort of this massive policy wrench that has been thrown into the workings, and not only in that it is distracting from a wide variety of global issues, but also take some of the pressure off of China. More importantly, it seems to be presenting sort of this kinetic front to this very sort of two-sided, ideological battle. So, Andrej, do you see this conflict shaping foreign policy and security in the EU? How do you see it shaping it between major powers and the globe in general? And I know this is sort of a very complex, comprehensive question, but that's why we have you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation. As I said before, our listeners didn't have a chance to hear it, but I said that it's interesting, very interesting for me, being a journalist from Slovakia, which is a country that has borders with Ukraine, talking here, basically in Pakistan, and also the Pakistani audience. And I'm glad that we have this conversation, because I would definitely agree with Michael. We need more condemnation from the world, and we need more discussions about what Russia is doing, because yes, I do believe this is a global issue. How it will shape the, let's say, the world order or security order, also in Europe and beyond, of course, it remains to be seen, because we don't know how the world might end. It still might end in very different ways, I would say. Now we entered the phase of, as many people would say, almost the attrition war. It seems that Russians are doing some smalls. They are moving forward and taking over some territories on the east of Ukraine, but not. It seems it is not decisive. We will see what will happen. But of course, it still might happen also that Russia might lose the will to wage this war moving forward. But on this, we need to resolve. We need to push against Russia back. President Zelensky, as you mentioned, said a couple of things. He was reacting on some speeches in Davos, at the World Economic Forum, when former foreign U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was basically suggesting that Ukraine should give up a bit of territory, and this might lead maybe to ceasefire, maybe to peace. There were other discussions about it, but yes, this is a problem because, as again, I would agree with Michael. We don't know what Russia would like to have, and having the real conversation with Russia is extremely difficult. This is something. Let's put it very frankly. I don't think that we can trust Vladimir Putin. I think that even I am not in the camp. Some people are saying, let's not talk to Russia at all. Some people are mocking, for example, French President Macron, that he's still trying to get to phone Putin. And, I have seen many jokes that Putin might be so fed up with Macron's phone calls that he will simply stop the war, because if he see his Macron's number again on displays, that he will just lose nerves, and he will say, okay, I cannot talk to this French guy anymore. I will stop and I will retire. Of course, this is not going to happen. This is a joke. Of course, we are joking also in a very very grim situation, because sometimes it helps you to move forward, I would say. But for Europe, it is a crucial issue. You mentioned something like neo-Cold War, and you don't see this term much in Europe, and definitely not even when we are talking about China. In fact, Europe really tried to somehow avoid this term. We don't want not being used by US and not being used by Europe, and not to get into some kind of neo-Cold War. But now with Russia attacking Ukraine, the order was shattered to the core, really. European Union, better to say it, was really based on the fact that we are going to have a peace. This was the idea, having a peace between France and Germany. And because in the history, there was a source of conflict, if basically the idea was, if we will solve this, the conflicts will somehow disappear. But don't forget, it happened for the Western Europe and beyond the Iron Curtain. My country, Czechoslovakia, at the time was a very different thing. But after the fall of the communism, EU also enlarged to the eastern and western, to the central and eastern Europe, and we wanted to join. And to be honest, we wanted to join also because there was very little trust that Russia might not behave as Russia behaved in the past, like trying to get the spheres of influence and trying to get over weaker countries.
Absolutely.
So this is something which we see now, like basically creating something which you might call, I don't even know if we can call it a now Cold War, because this is not a Cold War. This is unfortunately a hard war for Ukrainians. So as much,
and Andrej, is precisely the reason why I labeled that as sort of a new kinetic front, in which many were calling the new Cold War, but now there's a kinetic aspect to it, which also calls into question the many definitional elements that go into the entire thing. We will speak a little more about NATO and Sweden and Finland now looking to join, the sort of pressure that is coming in from Russia and Turkey. But before we do that, I also just want to make sure we pivot a little bit to the expertise of the great panelists that are with us here today. Dr. Lal, I have a question for you. President Putin, is pursuing a sort of a very concerted agenda of countering Western influence and bolstering strategic depth in the former Soviet bloc. And as I'm sure Saddam will tell you, strategic depth is a term that we are all too fond of and familiar with as far as Pakistan is concerned. And he's willing to do this by any means necessary. I know this is a topic that is sort of very close to your heart, but perhaps you can shed some light on what all this means from a sort of a democracy and human rights perspective, particularly women's rights, not to mention the plight of the millions of Ukrainian refugees we see on our television screens now.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that we all really need to think about. When we think about the conflict, I think often people are just thinking, okay, Russia wants to, take land, have power, and so forth, and we don't think about the larger implications. And some of the larger implications are that when you are taking over a country the way that Russia is, it's obviously undemocratic in and of itself. You're not asking the Ukrainians, hey, do you want to join? You're saying, hey, we're coming to take your country. Now, this is all part of Putin's larger philosophy of kind of expanding Russia's influence. He follows philosophers that believe in sort of a neo-fascist, right-wing fascist ideologies that say, you should sacrifice the individual for the state. And so the Russians who are going to the war, whether or not they believe in this, to fight for the government of Russia, they have to sacrifice themselves for this greater good of the Russian sort of empire, right? So Russia's foreign policy in itself is not inclusive, it's not democratic. And you can see that the women and children in the Ukraine are being sacrificed. They are being attacked. It's not just military against military. You're seeing the sacrifice of the individual for supposedly the greater good of the Russian state. And we're seeing it very concretely also in terms of how you're seeing the women who are fleeing Ukraine because the men are required to stay and fight. You're seeing the Russians using rape as a weapon of war against the women. You're seeing sex trafficking. Women are being called Nazi whores and told that they're not going to reproduce Ukrainians. Traffickers are posing as volunteers to traffic women. It's a very, very dangerous situation, in particular for women and children who are leaving the country. Now, I would say that in addition to that, there are other issues of democracy that are not as obvious as even that. One of them is just when we look at how the West and how the US has to counter this type of attack by Russia, the use of sanctions and the use of seizing of Russian assets, that in and of itself is creating a type of tension in many countries. You're seeing that some countries are saying, well, even though this is supposedly legitimate because, Russia has done something wrong, we definitely need to slap them and see how can we convince them to stop. At the same time, when the US has to use sanctions against Russia, many countries are sitting here saying, well, what will this happen to me eventually as well? Is this legal? What is legal in the international system, right? So there is that concern, and that concern itself tests the nature of the sanctions and could possibly push countries to move away from the dollar. We could discuss that a little bit more later. But the point is that there's a question, an underlying question of the democratic values underpinning the actual response to Russia. And of course, there is no real way to be democratic in responding to Russia. So the real question then becomes, how do we deal with this?
Thank you, Dr. Lal. And yeah, I think that's precisely the point. So much of the conversation centers around the fact that, of course, it's wrong, and of course, it's problematic, and these are some of the things that we should address, but practical steps towards it, particularly the sort of what I would call almost cognitive dissonance that exists between, even within the EU now, is really beginning to affect the conflict in sort of a very negative sense. Saddam, I want to bring the conversation a little closer to home. With Mariupol falling, the sea routes, one of them at least captured, Ukraine's maritime trade is especially affected. Russia's offered, there was a news piece earlier today or maybe yesterday, that they offered to provide sort of this I forget the term, I think it's humanitarian corridor for vessels carrying food to leave Ukraine. And by one estimate, there's close to 20 million tons of grain that are currently in silos stuck between the two countries, which of course also presents sort of a very perplexing moral dilemma, which is, do you allow the food security of the world to be compromised because sanctions on Russia are as important? So my question to you is, how do you decipher the Ukraine-Russia conflict sending ripples across the global economy? How significant is the impact of all of this, particularly for Pakistan? What does the future look like? If you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zeeshan. It's a pleasure to speak here. Russia-Ukraine conflict is particularly important for the global economy. It is hitting hard, especially we just dealt with the pandemic. So we are feeling a crunch a bit more. If it was not for pandemic, I guess we would have been adjusting pretty much quickly. But pandemic and then the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So it's basically hitting on 4 areas: the global supply chains, the energy security and the food security, and obviously the fuel and energy prices. The Black Sea region, I would call it, which is collectively the Russia and Ukraine, is contributing 30% of global food supply, which is wheat and maize in particular. And yes, you were right that 22 million tons of grains are blocked by Russia. So 25 African countries import 1/3 of their wheat from this Black Sea region, Russia and Ukraine. And these countries are poor or developing countries, and the poor people in those countries are vulnerable because the prices will go up because there's a shortage of wheat supply. So this kind of is sending ripple effects for the food security across the globe, especially in the North Africa and Middle East region and some parts of Asia. On the other hand, Russia is the third largest producer of oil and second largest exporter after Saudi Arabia and US. So the energy supply has been disrupted, which is making the price level of fuel to surge more. And this is indirectly affecting the global economy and Pakistan as well, especially the European Union region, which is like importing almost 30% of their needs from the Russia. So European Union is particularly hit by this crisis. And the news you were talking, I guess they have offered the corridor in reciprocating if the sanctions on Russia is reviewed. So they would allow the blockade of the naval blockade to open up if some of the sanctions against Russia are reviewed. On Pakistan, a direct impact is for the food security because 60 to 70% of our wheat imports come from the Black Sea region, Russia and Ukraine. So we are short of 3 million tons of wheat, which now due to the crisis, there are 2 countries left, US and Canada, which can supply the wheat and probably at a much higher price. So that is a fiscal pressure for Pakistan. And indirectly, fuel prices There's a fuel price effect in Pakistan due to this crisis, and fuel prices then linked to the food prices. So there's a double effect: food and fuel prices. Pakistan, due to the political instability, lower economic growth, and all that scenario, there's a fiscal pressure on Pakistan. So I have some recommendations that they may take, but I'll talk about them later as we build upon this conversation.
Sure thing. Thank you, Saddam. And thank you for this is precisely what I wanted to establish here, sort of drawing these direct lines between how this conflict, shapes energy security, food security in far-flung regions of the world that, at sort of a bird's eye view, may not seem like they have much to do with Russia and Ukraine, but in fact, simply because they produce so much of the world's food, so much of the world's food, as well as so much of the world's oil and fuel, it's inevitably going to affect them. Both to my two European panelists, Michael and Andrej, I just want to come back a little bit, and then we'll go to the other questions. There's two questions here. The first is, again, to come back to sort of building these parallels, right? A lot of conversation in Pakistan has been around, well, it's very similar to us because the fact of the matter is that we've had Afghanistan next door, and anything that's happening in Ukraine is very reminiscent of things that have happened in Afghanistan. The counter argument to that, of course, is that Afghanistan effectively has been in one form of conflict or another since the Soviet invasion in 1979. It's been almost 43 years that the country has been in conflict, the last year notwithstanding. Whereas it's been 77 years since Europe, a European country, has been directly invaded by another power. So that's the first part of the question. The second part is the sort of the global security picture is very much shaped by the global north. And sort of the equilibrium that is brought about by its, military presence. This combined might seems to have no significant effect on the conflict at the moment, aside from arms and logistical support. The security landscape is now, I would say, rapidly altering. Earlier, we spoke about very briefly with Sweden and Finland looking to join NATO, Russia and Turkey vehemently opposing the move, and the western border states railing against Russia. And with the end of the sort of the international conflict in Afghanistan, the Ukraine crisis is what I would call a clear test case for the shifting of security landscapes, with an increased focus on arming and securitizing Eastern Europe. How do the both of you, and Michael, will start with you and then go to Andrej, how do the both of you see the security landscape altering over the next few months and, more importantly, over the next 5 years?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And I understand the perspective in Pakistan, where our organization, Democracy Reporting International, also, we have an office in your country and working there for a long time. So I have often been to Pakistan, and I understand that Pakistanis look at this quite differently. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. And you see it through the lenses of Afghanistan and maybe of the American attack on Iraq as well. And so it has quite a different look. And I think the Russian communication very much tries to cater to these kind of perspectives. And I think the first thing to say, and Andrej can talk about that much better than me, of course, is that in Europe, we have the space for 200 years practically between Germany and Russia, which was always victim to the imperial ambitions. I'm German, so I say this, of course, very self-critically about my grandparents and grandparents and so on. But Germany and Russia tried to subjugate this whole region between them for a long time and pushed these countries, dissolved them partly, like Poland. They were run by empires. The Austrian Empire played a role as well. So if you look from that perspective, they see it very differently, and rightly so. And NATO has been a protection, and the Americans have been very welcome as this outside power that helps all these countries to determine their own course and not to be subjugated anymore by these powerful neighbors as they have been for a long time. So the perspective on this is very different in Europe. And after Second World War also, as I mentioned in the beginning, the idea that one thing we can all agree is nobody will try to change borders anymore. And we can talk 100 years about what happened in history, but we will not start saying, well, there they speak German and this belonged to us 150 years ago, and therefore we have to get it back. This is taboo. This has been taboo, and this taboo has been absolutely shattered. And I think that's a problem for the whole world. And that's why, in our view, it would be helpful if the whole world sees the precedents that Russia is creating there. Now, comparing this to Afghanistan or Iraq, I think especially Iraq was a tremendous disaster, and it was a crime, and it was based on a lie. So, and everybody who was very unhappy about this US-UK invasion of Iraq at the time, I think should be even more outraged about this Russian attack. I see some differences. First, the extent of lying. Only a dictatorship can say until 23rd of February, no, there will not be an attack. And then the next day they tell their own soldiers who didn't know, no, please attack, now it's starting. This can only happen in dictatorships. No democracy could ever just start a war and pretend to everybody and their own people that this won't happen. And that element of borders, of course. I mean, the US invasions did not try to build the 51st state of the United States in Afghanistan or Iraq. On the contrary, they were much criticized to just drop it like a hot potato last summer instead of trying to keep stabilizing Afghanistan. So there are differences, but definitely I think we have to be very self-critical about that very bad precedents have been set by the US, and I think especially in Iraq. And then your second question, unfortunately, all this will mean that Europe will become much more security focused. In the EU, we were so sure that war won't happen anymore, and there was a lot of underinvestment in military and in defense, and there's a huge rethinking now. And it's really, I think, a big pity, because the world really should not invest more money in weapons. We have so many other pressing problems, and this is also a reason where I think the more counter pressure we can bear on Russia to try to stop this and avoid that we go into new arms races that will, drain lots of resources for decades to come, the better. So I think everything for me speaks towards building the maximum pressure against Russia militarily, diplomatically, politically, to end this. And maybe we come back to negotiations, but that would be my perspective on this. And last point, if we talk about a new Cold War, I very much agree with Andrej. The old Cold War was largely cold. I mean, the Russians suppressed the Prague Spring, of course, and they killed many people in Budapest who wanted to get out of the communist bloc. But apart from that, it was a cold order, a cold war. There wasn't fighting. And that's very different now. We have very heavy fighting. So in a way, we cannot call this a Cold War. The big risk I see for the world is that people in Europe start thinking like in the Cold War and become every problem in the world is seen through the lens of Russia relations. And I think this would be really bad. Like Germany should have a relation to Pakistan that is based on many things where we have common interests, on many things where we have common concerns, and not only on, well, what do you guys think about Russia? This will determine everything. That would be very, very problematic, I think, for the new global order.
Yeah, I think any kind of bilateral relations that focus on sort of a singular point of ideology to create relations between nation states is doomed to not only failure, but also be extremely short-sighted and not particularly useful in the short, medium, or long term. Andrej, the same question to you, the changing security landscape in Europe.
Yeah, maybe one thing regarding to what was said previously about the problem of the exporting Ukrainian wheat. I said that the problem with Russia at this moment, as many people see that, is that Vladimir Putin cannot be trusted. So look what Russia is saying about this problem. A few days ago, they basically said, this is not our problem, we are doing anything. Then they said, okay, we can create some corridor. Now they say, okay, but you have to leave you have to scrap some sanctions, and at the end it's the West fault that this is the West created this problem. So I think this shows that any negotiations with Russia will be extremely difficult. But back to your questions, look, I absolutely understand that people around the world might see it a bit differently, and also not around the world, also in my country. It's not like that 100% of Slovaks think that Russia is is doing something bad, you will find quite a significant number who would say something like Russia is right, or at least they will say yes, Russia is doing what NATO was doing or US was doing in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Yes, I think, and I would agree with Michael, Iraq was an absolute disaster. Afghanistan at the end, we saw what happened last summer, and of course your country also has to live with the consequences of it. But I really think that we can walk and chew a gum in the same time. I think really people who are saying that Iraq was a disaster, if they are somehow trying to, somehow trying to make it as an argument that Russia is right, honestly, I don't get it. I really don't get it. I think we can distinguish those things and not just putting everything into one basket, every bad thing that happened in the history. Slovakia, look at the history of Slovakia. Slovaks never had a state. We only had a state from 1993, independent state. We have been part of Czechoslovakia before that part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. If some people will start to say, okay, where we are in history, should Hungary grab something or Czechs grab something of our territory or what? This is impossible. We cannot allow that. We have to have the rule-based order is not perfect, but let's try to make it better, not just to criticize every aspect of it. And yes, there will be securitization of Europe for sure. NATO is going to grow. Finland and Sweden will join eventually. Of course, there is a Turkey is opposing, but I think at the end, the NATO will be bigger. But it must be said very clearly, Finland and Sweden wouldn't apply for joining NATO if the war wouldn't start in Ukraine. That's 100% sure. There is no zero doubt about it. Everybody who is saying something different, that there was a secret plan how those countries will join NATO and how they will I don't know, threaten Russia. It's, excuse the word, it's bullshit. It's really. I will be in Helsinki on Monday, and I have many friends, a lot of people I know there, especially in Finland, but also in Sweden. That's what is happening is a direct consequence of Putin's decision to attack Ukraine. And of course, it happened in 2014, but we somehow closed our eyes. Yeah, they grabbed Crimea. Who cares about Crimea? Most of people there speak in Russia, then east of Ukraine. And now we have a huge conflict. Europe has to be ready, also military, unfortunately. But we are still really trying to avoid a real military conflict with Russia. It's basically what President Zelensky said, that NATO is doing nothing. On one hand, he was right, because really NATO is doing nothing directly against Russia, but doing something against Russia directly militarily, there is a huge, this would create a huge problem, of course. We know that, all of it. But NATO is trying to. So we are really trying to be somehow cautious over it and somehow balanced. I know it might not be for everyone, but this is a really complex issue, and we will see now. Just one last point: we will see now how long this unity in Europe will stay, because this is crucial. I think that basically Putin is betting on the fact that at one moment people will stop to care about Ukraine. It might, and in fact, it might happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that idea of sort of this global exhaustion from, armed conflicts happening around the world, and I know a lot of them have already happened in the global south, be it Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen or, where have you. But over the course of time, there's a certain amount of fatigue that does set in. And Andrej, I also want to thank you for bringing in that perspective, because I wanted to make sure that our audience got that perspective from sort of a smaller EU nation and what it's like right now, having experienced watching this invasion sort of unfold. But I want to pivot the conversation. We have about 20 minutes less, and Dr. Lal, I'm also aware of the fact that you have another engagement, so I want to make sure that we benefit from your analysis and your recommendations. So I want to move a little bit more towards, policy solutions, recommendations, what can be done, where do we go from here? And Dr. Lal, I think I'll start with you to sort of continue the conversation that you began when I first asked you that question, and sort of go more towards, without there being, as Andrej said, a kinetic effort by NATO to try and stop the conflict, what are some of the things that can be done to both protect the women and children in Ukraine in particular, human rights in general, and to also ensure that the refugee crisis is dealt with from a humanitarian perspective?
Here. So just looking first at the humanitarian issues, when you're talking about the women and children, we do need to think about, where they're going. So first of all, protecting the routes, as they're escaping into Europe, we need to make sure that there are, of course, people are wearing the vests and so forth, the real volunteers, but this needs to be overseen and made sure that, people the routes are actually secure. Also, when people actually reach Europe, you have to think about, how are we supporting refugees? It's a long period of time. We need to make sure that, is there some type of employment? Is there some type of way that they're secure? Otherwise, again, they will fall into the hands of traffickers, both the women and children who are entering Europe. So, so there's both the transit issue and then the issue of when safe refuge, when they're actually there. And I think there's also a larger question that I just need to bring up here, which is that this conflict is different in terms of the refugee situation than many others, in the sense that the women and children are very much the refugees. When you're looking at the Libya, when we're looking at Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, many of those conflicts, actually, the majority of refugees were men. And that actually created a different set of security issues that we need to think about. So when we look at a conflict and we look at the refugee situation, we do need to think about the gender of the refugees that are coming out and how do we support them, as well as the native population of the country that is on the receiving end. But having said that, there are a lot of other policy issues we need to think about. Obviously, yes, keeping the pressure up on Russia, thinking very hard about the reconstruction of Ukraine after this is done. Nobody knows when it will be done, but we need to be thinking in the future. There's been a lot of destruction. And again, there is a gender balance issue even in Ukraine when the war is done, because now we have a situation where you have a predominantly male population inside the Ukraine and the women and children have gone missing. So we need to think of, how do you reconstruct the society? How do you bring people back? How do you rebuild? So those are a few things just on the humanitarian side. However, we also just need to think in terms of geopolitics. And what does this mean overall? Is this supportable in the long term? Because when we look at, again, how countries are dealing with Russia and out of necessity dealing non-militarily with Russia at this time, we also need to think in the future, what does this mean for China? What does this mean for Iran? What does this mean for all of these countries who may say, we're all being excluded from the US system. Now, we have to think also in terms of, sanctions. Fine, we're having sanctions against Russia, but we need to be careful with the use of secondary sanctions. So, for example, if China or whoever wants to do trade and so forth with Russia, hitting them with secondary sanctions as a result will probably not be in the US or NATO or EU's benefit in the long term, because it does erode the effectiveness of these sanction or economic tools, the overuse, basically. We don't want to see a lot of countries all saying, okay, well, maybe it's time to use the renminbi, and maybe it's time to just move completely away from the dollar. So we need to think in terms of long term, what is sustainable also. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Lal. And everything that you brought up so far There's so many, it's easy to sort of focus on a lot of these divisions, ways in which, we can be different. And I think that just sort of comes from the sort of very tribal mindset the human society in general has. But if you really think about it, there's so many parallels here. You used a lot of words that the global south, this part of the world, has been dealing with, particularly Pakistan, for a very long time. Whether it is the issue of refugees, over the course of time, we've housed somewhere north of 7.4 Afghan refugees. Whether it's the issue of reconstruction, something that has come under a lot of fire in Afghanistan, having spent $2.6 trillion in there with not as much to show for it. Whether it is gender issues. And I'm really glad, because I'm going to pivot now to Saddam for a question, the secondary sanctions that you brought up, because that has a direct correlation for Pakistan. Pakistan is a country that sits very squarely at sort of the intersection of being one of the most vulnerable from climate change and a debt vulnerable country. If this country is given the option of buying wheat that is 30% cheaper or oil that is 40% cheaper, should Pakistan then really be sanctioned or punished for trying to engage in business, for example, as India has, for cheaper prices to fulfill the energy needs, the food needs of its population? And I guess that's my question to you, Saddam. You mentioned the number yourself. Last year, because of the wheat crisis that existed in this country, Pakistan exported something north of 60% of its wheat from Ukraine. If we have a wheat crisis this year, that may not be a possibility. That has serious implications for food security. Can you walk us a little bit more through some of the recommendations for the sectors that are vulnerable? If we have done any homework, what options do we have? And what is the way forward in order to ensure that both energy and food security in Pakistan is met?
Yeah, thank you, Zeeshan. First of all, I would like to speak a bit on refugee crisis from the economic perspective. In 2015, 1.3 million refugees from the Middle East entered into the European region. But the problem with them was that they were not skilled and not educated. So they were like kind of state took care of them. And that was a fiscal pressure on a European region and the countries. But experts are saying that the refugees, which are around now 5 million coming from Ukraine, are skilled and they are similar to the European people, and the value system is same. So there will not be a problem in adjusting, and they are skilled, so they can have jobs at there and they can contribute towards the economy. This is the new literature in economics. So that instead of being a pressure on the economy, they can contribute towards the economy. But that is, to me, it's a long-term phenomenon, because when refugees become part of the society, in the long run, you can raise revenues, they can generate demand. And with the generated demand, you can have a supply side, and then the productivity and the whole society and the economic growth lifts up. But that's a long-term phenomena that may take 5 to 10 years. But in the short term, there's a very economic crunch on the governments that are hosting the refugees in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of educating them, and social security system. And in parallel, the inflation rate in European region is like around 6%, and there was a high unemployment rate. So high unemployment rate and the high inflation rate, it means that there's less purchasing power. So it kind of creates competition for jobs between the Ukrainian refugees and the host countries. So this may trigger the conflicts and identity issues within the host countries. So that's a challenge for the European Union. As far as your second question is concerned, I have been told that the government of Pakistan, we are short of 3 million ton of wheat. So the government of Pakistan has given the green signal to put an order for 2 million wheat from any country, probably the Canada and the US. But that will be not cheap. So I guess there should be a targeted subsidy program for the poor and not for the else in the short run, because that's the only solution we can have. And on the other hand, the fuel prices, which is indirectly impacting the country because of the war between Ukraine and Russia. So the major chunk of the import bill of Pakistan is fuel. So fuel is a major problem for Pakistan. And I don't think so it is gonna go away very soon. So there are some recommendations circling around in the within the experts that there could be a 4-week working day, or work from home should be encouraged. Digitalization of education system should be encouraged in the short run, and targeted subsidies for those who ride motorbikes and 660 vehicles. That could be a targeted subsidy towards them, so that to lessen the pressure, the fiscal pressure and the import bill we are having. In the long run, we can have we have to have increased the productivity, the real productivity, so that we can export more, and foreign exchange. And when you have foreign exchange, then you don't have a problem in importing even at a higher price. So in the long run, we have to enhance our productivity and then more foreign exchange. In the short run, I already told you the recommendations. A bit regarding the bilateral economic activity between Russia and Pakistan and Russia and Ukraine. Pakistan and Russia has a trade volume of 711 million US dollar, and the trade between Russia and Pakistan is growing at 13% annually for the last 25 years. And with Ukraine, it's growing up to 15% annually in the last 25 years. So, but the exports are a bit less. We export to Russia around 25% of the total trade, and around 6% of the total trade to the Ukraine. And imports are much larger. In the layman language, what our concerns are: we export 40% of citrus fruit to the Russia and Ukraine, and we import 60 to 70% of our import is from those two countries, which could be a problem in the short run, because for the citrus fruits we have to find new markets and new buyers, and you have to renegotiate the prices, and then the logistics cost would add up. I don't know how it will work out, but eventually we'll find out, but it will take some time. Regarding wheat, there's a climate change, as you mentioned, due to the uneven rains and lesser rains and the heat waves. Wheat yield in Pakistan has gone down by 30%. So that's a problem. So either we have to come up with augmented technologies for the agriculture. We have to revolutionize the agriculture sector to maximize the yield. We can invest in R&D so that our yield becomes much more, and we have to become self-sufficient in the long run to avoid such, particularly in wheat, because we're an agriculture country. So these are the things which are in the minds of the people. But as the human psyche, everybody is waiting for the last second. It might stop. They may negotiate. There might be some chance for us to pitch in. So it's just watching the situation, and it's a game theory, I would say.
Absolutely, Saddam. And thank you very much for building a sort of very comprehensive sense. I think especially for the audience that is watching this particular policy roundtable, and particularly for people in Pakistan, I think that builds a very strong case for how this conflict is directly affecting Pakistan, especially in terms of energy security and food security. And I'm glad that you brought up, a range of these points, because we now have to think, as a debt-starved country, as a country affected by climate change, about what are some of these options, whether it's in agri-tech or other places, to be able to ensure that we can feed our own people, which used to be the case once, but is no longer. We have about 5 minutes left. Disparity in response to the crisis in Ukraine versus the global South. We've discussed that. Plenty of conversation and commentary on this front. I think people in this part of the world, while they are mostly cognizant of the severity of the situation faced by Ukraine, are also contrasting it against the many conflicts that have plagued us. The difference in levels of whether it's empathy or resources deployed to assist across a variety of metrics, broad coverage being some of the sort of salient examples. This is a short question for all of the panelists. How do you see this unfolding? How long will this go on before it gets any better? And even within Europe, how is this going to be shaping geopolitics, foreign policy, and interventionism in the years to come? Just short responses, please. And we'll start with Michael, then go to Andrej, then Dr. Lal, and finally Saddam.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting discussion. I learned a lot from colleagues also, some things I wasn't aware of. Just one thing to note is that Russia talks about the sanctions and exporting grain, but there's no connection. The sanctions do not affect Russia's ability to export grain. So the question we have at hand is how to push Russia to open up Odessa so that Ukrainian grain can reach global markets. On the broader question, as I'm a little bit skeptical at the moment whether there will be any end soon to this war, as I said throughout the program, the more pressure bears on Russia, the more hope we can have that they say, okay, the price is becoming too high, and we try to look for some kind of solution to this. And otherwise, if that doesn't happen, I think we look at a period with a lot of security concerns and a lot of focus on military matters, which I think is really bad for the world. So my overall plea would be that it's in all our interests that this finishes fast, and to do so, something has to be changed in the Russian calculations. As I said, they have not made any clear statement about what they want from this war, what would be the end game, etc., which is a clear sign that for the time they're in, and they see how much they can get out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Andrej.
There's not much to add what Michael said. I can only echo it. I would because really, let's stand with Ukraine against Russia. I think that we have to push Russia as hard as possible. Of course, in a balancing way, because nobody wants to start a nuclear war or something like that. But we have to push Russia. Really, if we don't do it, it doesn't make, it really, if we don't help Ukraine, it doesn't make other injustices better. It doesn't solve Yemen or Afghanistan. So hopefully, let's try to do something in Ukraine. But of course, let's also, I understand that the global South is looking also on other crises and what those crises mean for them. And just to add one thing from our region, in 2015-16, during the big migration crisis that was mentioned, our region, my country, I was ashamed how we have been dealing with the refugees coming from the Syria, other countries. Really, there was a xenophobic language. I hope now we are helping Ukrainians, but I hope it will also teach us that we also help to also other people, and then maybe also your region will try to better understand us. Hopefully, I just want to hope that.
Thank you, Andrej. And thank you once again for joining us. Dr. Lal? Sorry, Dr. Lal, your mic is up. Oh, there we go. Good.
Sorry, I was going to mention that, of course, we don't know when the conflict is going to end, so I'm not going to try and predict that one. But I would like to mention, in terms of the European scenario that you're talking about, what we're going to see, I do think that a large question that we haven't discussed that we need to think about is what's going to happen with energy. This cannot be understated or underestimated in terms of its power, because Russia supplies such a significant amount of gas to Europe via the Ukraine. So those supply lines are, of course, at risk over time, and Europe is deciding what to do in the future. Now, there's not agreement, right? I mean, countries like Hungary are saying, hey, we want to get all of our gas, all of our, from Russia, and you shouldn't try to stop us, right? So the issue is, how fast can Europe replace the type of energy supplies that they were receiving from Russia? And even if they do, the fact remains that Russia then, has a large amount of oil and gas that needs to reach global markets, and they will, reach somehow or another, whether it's through ways that were sanctioned, allowed by the West or not. So I think that's going to shape a lot of what we see in the future. What happens to the energy routes? Who's taking what? How do we deal with this? Who is Russia still selling to? Who's dependent on them? And what type of power relationships fall out of that?
May I have a 30 seconds?
Yes, of course, Andrej.
Just to add to it, we don't even have a discussion about gas. We are still talking about oil. Gas will be even bigger problem, and even this oil, there is no agreement within the EU. But what I think, we really have to speed up. We have to speed up the whole process to move towards the carbon neutral economy. I think this is very important also for the climate change.
And finally, Saddam, you have the last word.
Thank you. As my other colleague said that if you know Vladimir Putin, irrespective of his right or wrong, but if you look at the history, what he did in Chechnya and Crimea, he systematically launched the operations, and I don't think, looking at that history, that he will stop anytime soon. So the wheat problem would readjust, and some nations might have other option for the staple foods, rice and other things. They might shift to it, other would readjust. But the real problem is of energy, the oil and gas. European Union gets 25% of oil from Russia and 45% of gas. Andrej was right that the gas is the bigger problem. So the crisis precipitated the renewed conversation on sources of energy and the pace of energy transition from conventional into green energy. So in the short run, the European Union in particular and other countries would rely on coal and LNG, and in the longer run, they would go for the green energy, and you would see heavy investments in coming years in the green technologies and green energy. And this is, I guess, energy transition would be the key to detach yourself from the dependence on oil and gas from Russia and across the world.
I feel like this is a conversation that if we continued it, we could probably talk for an entire hour just on the energy aspect of this alone. But I think this is a good point to sort of wrap up the debate on. I want to thank you sincerely, Michael, Andrej, Dr. Lal, and Saddam, both for sparing the time, for providing such rich perspectives in both policy recommendations and explaining the massive ripples across the world, and in particular, as we are interested in Pakistan. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in from around the world and for engaging in these very important discussions. This concludes our policy roundtable for Ukraine. Please do tune in.
He froze in the last moment.
Yes, it seems.
Thank you, everybody.
Please
Perhaps
thank
the power failure issue might be.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah.
Very nice meeting you.
Thank you.
It was
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.